Welcome to Cambridge Forum. Tonight we'll be discussing Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness with Cass Sunstein, one of its authors, and I'm Al Roth, a professor of economics and business administration at Harvard. So many of you who just turned off your cell phones are still using the default ringtones and the settings that were on your cell phone when you bought it. And that's partly Cass's subject tonight. 40 years of research in psychology and economics has left us with a better understanding of how people make choices like these. We aren't always rational, we make mistakes, and we have a strong tendency to stick to simple things and to the status quo. And so the question that the book asks is, what does this knowledge of human decision-making mean for policymakers? Should the government, recognizing these human limitations, try to influence our decisions on issues such as obesity and health and savings? What's the moral content of creating policies that nudge us to make wise decisions? What's the role of government in this? These are some of the questions that Cass Sunstein will address as he discusses his new book, co-authored with his fellow Nudge, University of Chicago professor of behavioral science and economics, Dick Thaler. Once again, the book is Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. It's Cass's latest offering in a storied career as a professor of law, first at the University of Chicago and now at the Harvard Law School, where he's the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law and the first director of the new program on risk regulation. His research is wide-ranging, including constitutional law, environmental law, labor law, and behavioral law and economics. Behavioral law and economics, that's a phrase that you'll come to know. Sunstein presents original applications of legal theory to real-world issues that are sometimes provocative and always illuminating. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much. I'm completely thrilled to be here. The moderator, Al Roth, is actually one of my heroes, and to see so many people come out to talk about these questions, well, we must be in the midst of a financial crisis, mustn't we? The United States is entering a new era in terms of the occupant of the White House, the theory of governance. And one way to think about the presentation today is one angle on at least what some aspects of the new era might look like. Before we get there, I'd like to back up a bit and to go in a little time machine and tell you the origins of the ideas here. In the 1980s, I was a young, block-headed professor at the University of Chicago Law School in a time when the rational actor model was in the ascendancy in legal academia as well as in the social sciences, and it was having a very large impact on government policy. The rational actor model posited that at least for making predictions about behavior, and also for thinking about what government ought to do, we should suppose that human beings make rational decisions about the best way to promote their ends with respect to food, investment, exercise, smoking, everything else. As a block-headed young man, I reacted to these claims with a kind of clueless skepticism. It seemed to me, as to many others, that this notion of unbounded rationality was inaccurate. It didn't even capture the behavior of the proponents of the theories, some of whom were overweight or divorced even. At about the time that the clueless skepticism of some of us in the law school was reaching its height, a young economist then at Cornell named Richard Thaler was trying to bring to bear some work on human psychology and to introduce it into economics. Serendipitously, Richard Thaler came to the University of Chicago. We became good friends and co-authors, and for a long time thought, how can we use what we now know about human behavior to get our institutions working better? We developed an idea, which I am now going to name. It is called Libertarian paternalism. This is an unlovely name. It combines two multi-syllable and despised concepts. Paternalism, nobody likes, and libertarianism, well, Ron Paul didn't do incredibly well in the election. We think that libertarian paternalism, combining the two reviled concepts, shows us a path toward helpful interventions that can actually make lives go better. When we went around New York with our book called Libertarian Paternalism, the publishers thought we needed some paternalism and maybe less liberty, and so the book is called Nudge. Not, I hasten to add, nudge, an important distinction. Two poster children, let me get right out front, for libertarian paternalism or the nudge. Many Americans aren't saving for retirement. Lots of Americans have nothing at the time they retire. A simple intervention has been used in many workplaces, which has dramatically increased retirement savings, and it is automatic enrollment in a savings plan. The idea is once you get to the workplace, you are automatically enrolled in a 401k plan. If you don't like it, you can opt out. But the automatic rule is in rather than out. That simple intervention has produced dramatic increases in savings rates. That's my first poster child for libertarian paternalism. The second is a plan devised by my co-author Thaler, which I think is full of implications. It's called the Save More Tomorrow Plan. The idea is a lot of American workers don't want some of their current wages to go into their savings program. They need that money, or they think they do. But if they're asked, what would you think if some percentage of your future wage increase goes to savings? They say, okay, that's a good deal. I like that. Employers who have adopted the Save More Tomorrow plan have also produced very large increases in savings, and workers are delighted with the program. The third example of libertarian paternalism is slightly off color, very slightly. As men and women know, though in different ways, when men go to the bathroom, sometimes their aim is imperfect. As public health problems go, this is not number one on the list, but in some public places, such as airports, it's a little bit worse than irritating. In the Netherlands, a few years ago, a bunch of policymakers put their heads together and thought, how do we get men to aim better? Do we try moral suasion? Do we remind them of the harms and annoyance they're inflicting on others? None of that seemed to work. Instead, what they did was to paint a little black housefly at the relevant place in the urinal. That little design reduced spillage by 80%. These three interventions, the automatic enrollment plan, the Save More Tomorrow plan, and the housefly painting, not a real fly, turn out to be forms of libertarian paternalism. What I mean by that is they maintain freedom of choice. They insist that in a free society, people have an inalienable right to make a mess of their lives if that is what, on reflection, they want to do. No one's liberty is diminished by any of these three interventions. At the same time, they are paternalistic in the sense that there's an entity or a person or an institution in the background who's attempting self-consciously to steer people in directions that will make their lives go better. We thought at one point about calling our book One-Click Paternalism. In a moment of madness, who would buy such a book? Yes? But the idea of one-click paternalism does capture what we have in mind. We want to make it very easy for people to opt out of the solutions that are sought by the person who's trying to be helpful. The nudge program is undergirded by two assumptions, and they're quite straightforward. The first is that small changes in social context often have very large effects on our behavior. In cases involving restaurants or cafeterias or grocery stores, the order in which items are organized turns out to have significant and sometimes massive effects on behavior. In first thinking about libertarian paternalism, we thought of a little kind of thought experiment, not anything real, not a proposal, which involved a cafeteria director who decided to try to help kids eat better by having the fruits and vegetables highly visible at the front of the line and having the desserts and the less healthy stuff higher up and at the end. And we suggested in this fanciful thought experiment that by switching the order of the foods, there could be significant non-coercive effects on kids' diets. A few years ago, I was at a cocktail party, and someone who worked for Tony Blair came up to me and said, "We took your policy proposal very seriously." I thought no one aside from my mother maybe had read this article. And he said, "We implemented it, we redesigned our cafeterias, and we got kids eating much healthier." That has a kind of analytic resemblance, I think, to the housefly case, doesn't it? It's manipulating human attention. The idea behind this claim about small changes in context having massive changes in behavior, we organize under a second concept, and it's the only other one aside from libertarian paternalism, and the concept is choice architecture. The idea is that buildings have an architecture, don't they, in a way that will have large effects on what happens in them. You can design a building so that it's highly social and people are running into one another all the time, and that can have beneficial or undesirable effects. You can design a building so that it makes a great deal of space and privacy so that people see each other hardly at all and maybe are working like crazy, which can be desirable too. There's no such thing as a fully neutral architectural design with respect to buildings. You can't dispense with an architecture and have a building. Our claim is that choices are like that too. And rental car companies, cell phone companies, mortgage brokers, universities, employers, parents, certainly, children, often, all of these are choice architects in the sense that they set up the context against which people make their decisions. The contexts have often subtle, sometimes damaging, sometimes wonderfully beneficial effects on our decisions. And I hope you can see a suggestion implicit in these remarks that the environmental problems that the United States and other countries are running into, the credit card crisis, which is causing so much havoc all over the world, these are in important part a function of unfortunate choice architecture, which has steered people poorly rather than well. So assumption number one behind the nudge program involves the omnipresence of choice architecture, often involving subtle influences with a big impact. The second assumption is that decades of work in psychology and economics has established not just that kind of clueless skepticism about the rational actor model is accurate, but also specified the way that human beings deviate from the axioms of rational choice theory. The notion is, and this has actually neurological evidence about the brain, that human beings have two families of cognitive operations in their heads. Each of us does. One, imaginatively referred to in the literature as System 1, is impulsive, quick, often emotional. When it hears a loud noise, it says, run. When the plane starts to tremble, it says, threat. When a dog is large and starts to open its mouth, it says, flee. System 2, by contrast, is more deliberative, it's more calculative, it's slower, it's less intuitive, it often runs the numbers. System 1 often rules our behavior, but System 2 is often a better guide. A way to be a little more particular about this is to say that we now know that human beings use mental shortcuts that aren't exactly irrational, but that get us into trouble and are systematically biased in our approaches to social situations. Here's an example of a bias which has an upside. Human beings are pervasively unrealistically optimistic. If you ask most people whether they're safer than the average driver, 90% will say yes. If you ask college teachers whether they're better than the average college teacher, 94% will say yes. If you have a couple and ask them what percentage of the household work you do, and then add up the two, if you get a number that's not over 100%, it's a very unusual couple. Okay, unrealistic optimism can get us in a lot of trouble in the sense that it can lead us to take insufficient precautions. We also know that human beings are very reactive to whether recent events have caused alarm or not. Many of the specialists before the 9/11 attacks said there have got to be better security precautions at airports. The risks are real. But both ordinary citizens and public officials said we can't remember an occasion on which a serious terrorist attack occurred in the United States. What's the point? Expensive, inconvenience-inducing precautions. That's sometimes called unavailability bias, meaning the unavailability of the event causes underreaction to a genuine risk. Think Hurricane Katrina and the reaction of many people who lost their property and sometimes their lives in advance of the hurricane. Okay, availability bias, by contrast, can make us terribly frightened of a risk that really isn't so large. And my hope is that everyone listening can think of an example in their own lives where a risk did come to fruition, and for at least a time, there was a kind of fear leading to precautionary behavior that wasn't justified by reality. That's what System 1 does. It reacts greatly to the existence or absence of recent salient events. Human beings are unrealistically optimistic, other things being equal. They're very much buffeted about by recent events or their absence. We also know that human beings are loss averse, which is just a way of saying that people hate losses from the status quo. In fact, they hate losses from the status quo more than they like corresponding gains. If you tell people, if you use energy conservation strategies, you will save $200 next year, you get a real but modest reaction. If you tell people, if you don't use energy conservation strategies, you will lose $100 next year, you get a much larger reaction. To phrase it as a loss from the status quo rather than a gain has a big impact. And notice the Save More Tomorrow plan exploits loss aversion. It says you're not going to lose anything you now have, you're going to have a reduced future gain. Human beings are pervasively loss averse. We also know that conformity pressures have a tremendous influence on what each of us does. When people are going into real estate big time, it's often because they think other people are doing the same or believe that that's the thing to do. When people are exiting the market in a kind of panic, it's often because conformity pressures are leading them to react strongly. There's nothing irrational about reacting to the beliefs and actions of other people, but it is the case that human beings sometimes can look like herds or lemmings, and that can get each of us into trouble. Incidentally, lemmings are not a species that goes over a cliff into the water and commits suicide. The belief to that effect is a result of an all too human cascade. Okay, I'm just going to give now, by way of a closing, one example of a nudge and to suggest its immense power to be used for good or for bad. And the simple nudge here is the default rule. With respect to cell phones or credit card plans or rental car plans, the default rule is often very sticky, meaning human beings often stay with the default rule, even though if it were otherwise, they'd stay with that one too. I got a lesson to this effect a few years ago when American Express notified me, and I was very pleased to hear this, that I could get 3 months of 5 magazines for free. That's good. How can you lose? So I chose 5 magazines. I didn't like any of them particularly, but to get them for free, that's net good. Here we are about 9 years later, and I'm still subscribing to the same magazines. It's just I have to call them up. I'm paying now, and I have to call up to cancel. I recently learned from someone at Time Magazine that if they can get people in automatic resubscription, the resubscription rate is about 80%, and they think that's misleadingly low because the other 20% have either moved or died. If you have to get people to resubscribe on their own, then it's about 20%. The default rule is immensely powerful in multiple domains in which the government or a private institution sets them. Why is it have such an impact? Well, it seems that the default rule carries information about what it's sensible to do, and it's a signal about proper behavior. But there's another reason the default rule works so well, and it's that inertia is an immensely powerful human force. As a university professor, I am in a plan called TIA-CREF, and I am proud to say I'm at the median level of changes in TIA-CREF for a university professor over a period of decades. The median number is 0. Okay, so the suggestion is that default rules have tremendous power, and if we're interested, a new president, a new administration, a new Congress, in doing something about health care, about credit markets, about poverty, the manipulation and savvy switch in default rules often can have exceedingly beneficial results. One example is a quick and easy way to save at least hundreds and maybe thousands of lives each year in the United States would be to shift from a default rule from organ donations, from you have to opt in to make your organs available, to you have to opt out. We have every reason to think that if the default rule is you want them to be available, you'll have a great increase in available organs. The opt-in rule, people are frequently reluctant to upset the status quo. Okay, I've tried to suggest that libertarian paternalism is not an oxymoron, that nudging is a feasible project, that it takes advantage of the fact that small changes in social context often have massive effects on our behavior. I've tried to suggest also that people are boundedly rational in ways that we now understand pretty well. The default rule is the simplest nudge for maintaining liberty while also steering people in preferred directions. There's a larger agenda here, and I'm going to tell you about it right now. For too long, the United States has been caught between often people on the right who see Ronald Reagan as the giant figure looming over their policy proposals, suggesting that markets, 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 and liberty, liberty, liberty are the organizing principle for private and public institutions. On the other side of this pitched battle have been usually liberals, people left of center, who see Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ghost or shadow, giant, and the notion is that when people's decisions run them into trouble or into the ground, the best approach is one that involves regulatory mandates and bans of the sort that Roosevelt did introduce in many domains. What Thaler and I think is that this battle is a 20th century one that's decreasingly suited to the numerous problems that the 21st century presents. That it's possible to agree with those who see Reagan's ghost that ultimately freedom of choice is usually the best guide, while also agreeing with those who think fondly of Roosevelt that people's decisions often get them into big trouble, especially when they're asked to plan over the long term. There was a lot of talk under Blair and Clinton of the possibility of a third way, something between the way of markets and the way of commands. It never went very far. We don't think that with the nudge program we've identified anything like a holy grail. But if there is a way to combine the kind of compassionate interest in protecting people against their own propensity to error, while also insisting that planners ought not to override individual choice, if there is such a third way, the nudge might be the place to start. Thank you.
I'll start the discussion with a question of my own, and then we'll ask for questions from the audience. I know you've given this a lot of thought. It's apparent from, the human factors of cell phones and from marketing that we're all very susceptible to nudges. But when you start to think of it as a political movement, how will we watch the nudgers? If nudging is so powerful, how do we trust and regulate government as it nudges us?
It's a great question. And let me try avoidance first, as one should with a great question, and then direct response. The avoidance is that for those who take the question as a rhetorical one, that is the incompetence and bias of the nudger, often should counsel us against nudging. Notice, if you would, that nudging in a certain sense just isn't avoidable. That if the government is going to have a Social Security plan or a prescription drug plan, or if cell phone companies are going to have plans, or if there's going to be property and tort and contract law, there are nudges. So just like buildings can't lack architecture, so nudges can't be eliminated from the human domain. That's the avoidance point. The answer point is transparency. So the best way to protect against bad nudges is to make sure that the government is required to disclose what it's doing. And if it's having an energy plan that has certain features, we should nudge it as well as it nudges us by ensuring that the contents and grounds and interests that turned into the energy plan are available. So there's a suggestion that the next administration will be the first internet administration. And if so, that will be a mechanism for transparency. Another way to put it is that both markets and democracy, in their different ways, are nice corrections, aren't they, against self-interested or incompetent nudging. And before the financial crisis, at least, the thought was that market pressures will ensure that bad nudgers will just be competed out. If your cell phone has ridiculous default rules that ensure if you don't change it, your fees are going to go through the roof, that cell phone company isn't going to be terribly popular. But there are some domains where market pressures actually reward rather than undermine the self-interested nudger. The suggestion is that markets often work well. Democracy provides its own checks. A new era of transparency and disclosure requirements are the first crack at safeguards.
Thanks. Let's take some questions from the audience. If people who'd like to ask questions will line up at the microphone, I'm going to hope that the questioning will be self-organizing, but I reserve the right to nudge recalcitrant questioners.
I love your approach where you have relatively simple changes that produce huge positive results. It's just, I like the simplicity of it and also the effectiveness. But I'm wondering, in something as complicated as the economic crisis that we're in now, are there some aspects of it that would sort of lend themselves to your particular approach, this kind of default system where you're sort of in unless you're out? But you get the idea behind it. Yeah.
Yes, there in a crisis, it might be that the nudge response is just pitifully inadequate. So because the economic crisis is on so many people's minds, let me talk just a little bit about why it occurred. The answers are multiple, but three reasons are closely connected with our concerns in the project. One involves bounded rationality, where if I don't know how many people here have signed a mortgage within the last 15 years or so. They're really complicated. And people presented with complicated forms often follow what we call the yeah, whatever heuristic. And so the fact that the forms are so complicated and that the fine print that puts you really at serious risk is incomprehensible is an ingredient in what led to the problem. So bounded rationality in dealing with complex transactions. A second is temptation, that Homo sapiens, as opposed to Homo economicus, suffers from self-control problems. And there used to be a norm, which is you should have your mortgage paid off by the time of retirement. Indeed, there also used to be a norm, which is if you have extra cash, you should use it to pay off your mortgage. That norm fell in the last decades, with refinancing being part of the reason. So people would refinance and use the money not to pay off the loan, but to get a vacation in Hawaii. Temptation is a contributor to the problem. And a third problem, a real part, is herd behavior, where the boom of about 1997 to 2003 roughly was a speculative bubble, identified as such by behavioral economists who said that the widespread view that home prices always get bigger is just historically inaccurate. This is the only outlier time in the last 50 years is in that roughly 7-year span where they're jumping. How could that happen? It seems to be it was a result of a kind of social cascade in which people were talking to one another and steering each other up into bad investments. Okay, so in terms of preventing future crises of this sort, I think we don't want only, and maybe we don't want mostly, to rail against greed and corruption. We want to understand what kind of human fallibility led people to make the deals that created these problems. And the way in would be to say, how do you protect people against temptation, this form of herd behavior, and mismanaging complexity, let's call it. And the first crack answer is requires things to be transparent and simple. So we have disclosure requirements that are unhelpful because it's just so complicated in detail. You're going to drown or something in the material. Simplified transparency, Thaler and I think, would be a nice safeguard. Incomplete, perhaps, but a start in a way that would get markets going. And if this seems a little bit optimistic, think for a moment, if you would, about nutritional disclosures at the grocery store, where it is simple, where you see how the caloric content, et cetera, and that has had very beneficial effects. Now, this won't get us out of the current crisis, but it might be a safeguard against future crises. And gosh, we've had this one just for a few months now, so we need a lot of sustained empirical as well as theoretical work to understand what exactly the mechanisms were and how to prevent them in the past from happening in the future. It would be a big surprise if human frailty wasn't a huge contributor, and that's what we want to ensure our regulators are attuned to.
Thank you. I have other questions, but the line behind me is long. So.
In today's news, there was a article on heart attacks have dramatically been reduced in this area, Greater Boston, Massachusetts, because of no smoking in restaurants. Now, I would think that a nudge was when they said no smoking sections, but they had to legislate in order to get the smoking out of the restaurants entirely. So I think that sometimes legislation is necessary.
That's a great question. Thank you. What would a nudger think about smoking? Okay, at first glance, the nudger wants smokers to be informed of the risks they face. So disclosure requirements, clear, concise, simple, vivid, would be the first line. The second line the nudger thinks is, look, even if people are told about the risks, they might not process the information sensibly. So here's a statistic for you. Smokers have, if anything, an exaggerated sense, actually, of the risks that smokers face. But individual smokers tend to think that they themselves are at less risk of heart attack and cancer than non-smokers. You ask your average smoker how their risk compares with that of the average non-smoker, they say, I face that risk less. So it's one thing to understand the statistical reality. It's another thing to have a vivid sense of its personal reality. So the nudger would say, okay, information isn't enough. You want to take steps so that people understand the statistical reality for them, not in the abstract. And we can imagine ways to do that, and some public education campaigns have tried what are sometimes called debiasing strategies by giving a vivid sense to people of what the threats they personally face. And there's evidence that this is itself working. Okay, for the people who like the finding that heart attacks in Massachusetts have gone down significantly and the claim that this can be attributed to smoking bans in public places, nudging isn't enough. And not only is a ban on smoking in public places beyond a nudge, a no smoking section is beyond a nudge too, because that imposes more than one click costs on smokers. They have to go to the section. It's not a big coercion, but it's beyond what we're talking about. So let me say a little bit about that. Nudgers acknowledge that in some cases the acts of one person hurt others. And so sometimes we're interfering with people's freedom not to protect their welfare, but to protect third parties. And insofar as the smoking restrictions can plausibly be defended as a way of protecting non-smokers against the health risks or the irritation that comes from the presence of smoke, then something more aggressive might be justified. Whether that would satisfy the anti-paternalistic person depends on the evidence, doesn't it? You might say at this point, I don't really care about the effects of secondhand smoke. I want to protect those smokers, and nudging won't do it enough. At this point, the nudger will say, well, you're going to have to persuade me that there's something special about smoking that justifies paternalism of the non-libertarian sort. And we could imagine some candidates. We could imagine that that people are addicted, get addicted in a way that overcomes their standard capacities. Or we could say that when people first start smoking, they have such a weak understanding both of the risks and of their own inability to quit, that the original decision is not worthy of the same level of respect that most original decisions are. And the nudger might start pricking up his or her ears at that point and say, oh, you're pointing to ways that system one in the brain, the more primitive, intuitive kind, can lead us very badly astray in such a way as to justify sometimes a more coercive intervention. And the nudger, I think, will have to yield and say there are some such cases. For example, the nudger would, to be fully principled, want nudges against suicide and not bans. But I confess, I think that a legal ban on suicide is an important part of entrenching a social norm that protects people in periods of distress from taking their own lives. And we might think that there are certain forms of behavior which are close enough to suicide to justify the override. But in most domains, at least, the idea is the preferred approach is not to mandate, but to help.
I am. Something, first of all, just a one-word answer question. Does a cigarette tax count as a nudge, or is that something else? Is it a nudge, yes or no?
No.
Perfect. I was wondering if you could talk about what nudging could do for the environment, specifically if you talk about global warming and pollution. What sort of nudges do you envision?
Okay, let's take two examples. Of all the examples in our book, the housefly one has gotten the most attention, which in a way is, for the authors, that's not great. But the unrealistically optimistic view is that the reason it's gotten so much attention is that it's profound, not that it's off color. And the unrealistically optimistic view would say, for the environment, a real problem is that we don't see, it's not visible, the environmental costs of what we're doing, even when ultimately we're going to pay the economic price either in dollars or in health. So when you spend a week running your air conditioner or heating equipment, chances are you're not seeing on a moment-by-moment basis what the costs are, even to you, let alone the environment. There's an organization actually not far from here that invented something called the ambient orb. The ambient orb is a little ball which lights up. It's attached to your electricity system, and it lights up red when you have high levels of use and lights up green when you have low levels of use. An energy conservation focused utility company decided to give people the ambient orb and see what effects it had on behavior. It reduced electricity use by 40% in the relevant households. And it's because people didn't like to see that red ball. It might be that they thought to themselves, money, my wallet's hurting when they see the red ball. Or it might be they think, I'm not being a good citizen, that this is having environmental and other effects. Okay, that's one nudge that has been effective. Here's another that I'm even more excited about, I confess. There's a company in California that wanted people to conserve energy and tried various strategies, nothing worked. What they ultimately did was to tell people who were above average users just that fact on their electricity bill. You are an above average user of electricity. And they told people who were below average users, you are a below average user of electricity. The good news is the above average users significantly cut their use, either because they thought they were being bad citizens or they were foolishly losing money. The bad news is the below average users increased their use. But there was a little intervention. This was the first of a series now of projects that utility companies are using. There was a little kind of wrinkle on the what I've just described, where they had a smiley face for the below average users. You're a below average user. Smiley face. Then they didn't go up to average. They stayed below average. And all over the country, utility companies are telling people, excellent, you're a way below average user. And they're even saying not only compared to average, they're comparing people to efficient neighbors, saying you're above your efficient neighbors, or you're right with your efficient neighbors, or you're better than average but below your efficient neighbors. And these are having very significant effects. And it's a little bit of a movement here. So the ambient orb nudge, what it manipulates is people's attention. That's the kind of behavioral insight that most of the time we live our lives on automatic pilot, and unless something really goes across our view screen and grabs our eye, we're not going to attend to it. And the environmental problem is partly a product of an absence of attention. Also, people are very susceptible to knowing they're doing worse than their peers. And in the environmental domain, a lot can be done to help by telling people who are above average users, that's just what you are.
My question concerns the persistence of positive effects over time related to your nudge examples. Some of the examples seem compelling, some less so in that sense. If I'm in a Save More program and assuming that wages aren't stagnant or inflation isn't high, everyone seems to get better over time. In the example of the fly, if people learn after a while it's a decal and not real, does behavior go back to the old norm? If kids remember to look up and not down when they walk into the cafeteria, does behavior go back to a norm? What I'm asking is if your improved choice architecture erodes over time in some of your nudge examples, and it has a surface sort of plausibility, but social scientists haven't really measured it against controls to see whether there really is positive persistence over time.
It's a fabulous question. We know that making things automatic is robust over time. So I don't know how many of you have automatic bill payment. If you don't, maybe the next day get it. You'll save money probably as well as convenience for automatic bill payment, and that by definition pretty much is robust. You'll be paying after you've moved or after your great-grandchildren are living in your house. So that one is robust. It seems to me both private and public institutions have done far too little to exploit the power of making things automatic. Some advisors to the president-elect have referred to iPod government, by which they mean in part making things really easy, in part by saying, if you don't do anything, you're going to get stuff that's good, that works for you. Okay, then you're right that it's possible in principle that some of this stuff could decay, if only because what makes it effective is it's getting your attention, and after a while it becomes part of the background again. So that's an important point. We haven't come to terms with that, and I don't know of data with respect to our examples. On the fly, I'll tell you a way it might go on the fly. It seems to be that with the flies painted there, guys can't help but to aim at it. It's almost evolutionary. And if that's true, it won't decay. And I don't think the guys think that's a real fly. We think it's a game, and we can do it. If you think about car design, some of the new hybrids, like the Prius and the Camry, operate on a similar principle of attention, where you can see your fuel economy on a moment-by-moment basis, even, and people compete with each internally to make sure that this tank, I'm not going to do worse than last tank. And they get somewhat alarmed if they're doing less well than they've typically done. So it's driving, so to speak, your attention in that direction. That would be expected it would decay some. We don't know. On the ambient orb, it could go the other way, couldn't it? Where the ambient orb becomes a little like teeth brushing, where over time, for a large part of the populace at least, the automatic nature of it, meaning you do it in the morning and at night, doesn't mean you stop doing it. It means that's just what you do and what you look at. And the ambient orb could have a similar feature. So you've got an important point. What I'm just not sure of is what are the examples when the attention-grabbing nudge ceases to grab attention? It becomes like furniture after a while.
This is not fasten your fly. The next administration, one might say it's maybe a bit simplistic, but I guess perhaps largely it could be seen as a System 2 administration. I'm, I guess, thankful for that. I want to ask about a blog entry that I noticed of yours a couple of weeks ago, where you said, and correct me if I'm not paraphrasing correctly, that people who thought Obama was progressive are mistaken, that he's really not progressive in the way those people might think that, and I forget whether the term was centrist or what exactly, but something like that. And while I would disagree with what I took to be the implication, which was that, well, those people have no reason for thinking that, they're just deluded, I think there was a kind of studied ambiguity about the Obama campaign, which is partly responsible for why a lot of people might have mistakenly thought that. But I guess the key question that I want to get to for you is, since you know him personally and I think are more familiar with him politically than certainly I am, could you talk about where you think he really is politically, what we can expect from him a little bit in this next administration, and how, even though you might not agree with us, those of us who would consider ourselves more progressive, who would like a swift withdrawal from Iraq, who would like not to have an increase in troops in Afghanistan, who would like to entertain the possibility of a single-payer health care reform, how do we nudge or nudge the next president?
Okay, there's a lot there. And I hope I didn't say that he's not a progressive, but instead a centrist. Because I don't think that's the right way to think about Obama. I think what makes him a bit new in American politics is that to say there's a continuum from the far left to the far right, and on what point does he stand on that? That's kind of the way of thinking of politics that he is trying to transcend. So I guess what I'd say about him is that he's highly empirical and very pragmatic, that he does stand with those aspects of the progressive tradition that are really concerned with ensuring that every American have a chance. So notice his intense concern with education, his longtime interest in, I hope your eyes won't glaze over, the earned income tax credit, which is a way of ensuring that the working poor have more money. He is in that line of democratic, both small d and capital D thought, that thinks that in America, everyone, wherever you're born, should have a real crack at it. And in that sense, it's fair to describe him as part of the progressive tradition, not as the redistributor in chief, and not as a socialist. The reason I think these old categories just don't work for him is that he's highly pragmatic. So for nuclear power, for example, which many progressives have, their system one rebels strong, and their system two has good concerns about. As senator at least, and I expect this would be true as president also, he's empirical. He says, what do the facts show? So on issues involving the environment, he wants to find market-friendly ways to do what must be done. So he's given Republicans credit for having market trading programs for the environment. I guess I think that there is a kind of progressive that thinks, because I'm a progressive, I believe these sorts of things, and I want to evaluate a candidate in terms of whether he has these beliefs. And that seems to me to listen too poorly to what either a public official or a skeptic would say. And so Obama is an amazing listener. I mean, that's really one of his great features. I taught with him at the University of Chicago Law School, and any argument he's willing to listen to. So I think you'd probably be surprised at unpredictability isn't quite the right word, but uncabinability. It's just not categories for him. I can say in connection with some of the ideas here that he is the first president we've had who is on top of behavioral economics. He also knows some old-style economics, and the automatic enrollment for savings plan is something that he actually talks about in his book, The Audacity of Hope. And in speaking of credit markets, credit cards, school loans, mortgages generally, transparency has been, long before the crisis erupted, part of his, a central part of his policy. He thinks, people just aren't being given anything straight about what the deal is, and the government has an important role to play there. So I guess I'd say foreign affairs, that's not a domain I know very much about. But I'd say give him a chance, see what he's doing, and if it seems like he's not promoting goals that you hold dear, then we have a democracy, and if there's anything that's central to him, it's self-government. He's a listener in person, and he's a listener in public life. And there's a beautiful part, this maybe will bother you a bit, I hope not, where of his book, The Audacity of Hope, where he talks about abortion, and his website had a very strong stand, very strong pro-choice stand, and was very hard on Roe against Wade's critics. And he got a letter from a doctor at the University of Chicago saying, you know, I respect you, but what are you doing in your website, casting contempt like this on me when I have moral convictions that are pro-life? And Obama changed his website, and he said, that night I said a prayer that I could give the same kind of presumption of good faith to that doctor that he clearly gave to me. And that's a bit exemplified in what I found the most moving part of The Audacity of Hope, where he said, speaking again of abortion, he said there are feminists, middle-aged feminists in America who mourn their own abortions, and there are religious women in the United States who don't believe in abortion, who have paid for the abortions of their best friend's daughter.
To me, one big thing that I'm not hearing here is, well, two things. One is how perhaps corporations have already nudged or a lot of our laws so that there aren't always choices. If you take transportation, it's only within the last few years that there are more fuel-efficient vehicles that are more readily available to more people. And so that's one aspect. And then another is the whole area of advertising, which is just, seems to me to be like super nudging.
Yeah, I think there are three really important points about choice architecture by corporations. First, insofar as corporations deal directly with their customers, they are choice architects. So when you buy a product, there's choice architecture, which may or may not serve you well. If the market's functioning properly, then the people who are exploiting you will be competed out. And thank goodness that happens a great deal of the time. But because System 1 is often in charge, people, sometimes companies benefit from exploiting people and are, if you try to deal with people fairly, you'll be competed out. So first, there's choice architecture, and markets will sometimes ensure bad choice architecture. The credit crisis is partly a product of that. Second, the point about advertising, that's really important, that advertisers are, at least intuitively and possibly by training, highly attuned to optimistic bias, to availability bias, by saying, you know, I know a person who used this and great things happened, and to loss aversion. They say, you can't afford not to get this product. So they have all the tricks. They know about how people can be tempted, and they try to tempt them by appealing to that part of our brain that is temptable. So advertising is true, and then the third point is also a really good one, that at the public action by our representatives often embeds a kind of choice architecture for which well-organized private groups are responsible. So one example, which the whole story is more interesting than I'm going to tell, but think of President Bush's prescription drug plan, which has choice architecture in it, in one sense of the good sort, that seniors get to choose from more than one option, because President Bush is right, one size doesn't fit all. But it's also the case that seniors go on a website and have to figure out which of 25 or so to choose, and it's a complete mess. We tried to do it in writing the book, go on the website, and if you misspell Xanax, if you put a Z rather than an X in, instead of, like Google, saying, did you mean, instead it says, that's not a drug, or we hate you, or something. And after all the time we spent on this trying to get a drug plan for a hypothetical senior, we felt we ourselves needed Xanax. This was terrible, and there's little question that some aspects of the prescription drug plan is a product of corporate interests trying to push the plan in directions that are economically beneficial and not in consumers' interests. So that's a real challenge.
My question is actually very related to that, which is just, what do you do in a circumstance where a corporation's product is the status quo? So how do you nudge people against doing something that they've, in your example of the Time magazine resubscription, I think that's a good one, but also just if a geographic area is completely dominated by, say, Walmart, or if someone's accustomed to always eating at McDonald's, what kind of an entity can nudge someone in the other direction? I mean, how is that possible?
That's great. I think I only have very conventional answers. If you have a monopoly, a literal monopoly, then the government should get rid of the monopoly. If you instead have a product that people love, like Walmart's or McDonald's, then you need to introduce a competitor, yes, that people will like better, and there are techniques that can be used which could involve moral suasion, if you think Walmart is mistreating people, or it could involve just delivery of goods that are better if not cheaper, and are cheaper if not better. And for McDonald's, there are things to do about health that seem to be having some traction, aren't they, in producing alternatives to McDonald's. So the pedestrian point I'm making is that in a market, the only thing you can really do is first to do better, and second to use the techniques we know about human behavior to move people in directions that will promote their interests. I'm thinking that there's more to be said about this great question, and I'll tell you one thing that I think your question is onto that we haven't talked about enough. It's a little experiment I did at the University of Chicago where I said, there's a plagiarism policy at the University of Chicago. I asked a whole bunch of students, which is that if you plagiarize the first offense, you're suspended for 2 years of law school. A number of members of the faculty think that's too tough, and it should be turned back to a one-semester suspension. What do you think of that? Then I asked another large group of University of Chicago law students. We have a plagiarism policy at the law school. There's a one-semester suspension. A number of members of the faculty think that's too weak, and it should be shifted up to a 2-year suspension. The ones who were told the current policy is a 2-year suspension said, that's good. It shouldn't be made more lenient. That would be bad. And those who were told it was one semester suspension, should it be made tougher? They said, no, that'd be bad. We should stay with the one semester suspension. So, and I did this at Chicago, about Chicago students. They happened not to know what the policy was. I think that's because they're so honest they didn't care. They stuck with the status quo. Then I did it at Yale about Chicago. They stuck with the status quo. So it may be that Walmart and McDonald's sometimes are more successful just because that's what people are used to. And then, so this is a great question. And there are some thoughts that are in the book about how to jar people out of a routine. And one way to do it is to make it really easy, to give them a very clear path, or to ask them certain questions. Like if you ask people, do you plan to vote? People say yes in a way that outruns the percentage of the population that actually does. But those who are asked that question end up voting more. So if you say to people, would you try an alternative to McDonald's? If they say yes, then they're more likely to. So there are a bunch of strategies for jarring people out of the status quo. It's a great question.
Briefly ask, you would suggest do that jarring? Do you see that coming from the government? Do you see that coming from private groups?
It depends on the organization, doesn't it? I mean, if it's the Democratic Party trying to get people to vote in Missouri, then it's the Democratic Party. If it's a company trying to get people to go to a new restaurant, then how exactly it asks people is a nice question. But kind of functional equivalents of that, either through advertising campaigns or through signs. Okay, one kind of clue about the importance of small changes is if doctors tell patients of 100 people who have this operation, 90 are alive after 5 years. if the medical condition is a certain way, people have the operation. If you tell them of 100 who have the operation, 10 will be dead after 5 years. They say no, even though it's the same, right? So if it's framed, if the relevant question is framed the right way with respect to supermarket choice, I'm stumbling a bit over exactly what the comparative advantage of the new Walmart would be. But there are ways of saying if you go to Walmart, you're losing X, rather than if you come here, you're gaining Y. That's a way to do it.
Thank you.
So, thanks. Yeah.
You began your talk by talking about the problems of the rational actor model. And I wanted to ask you how you would counter my argument, which is that there are dangers of treating people as non-rational actors and effectively exploiting their more instinctive non-rational impulses. Two of the examples you cited, I wanted to draw attention to a couple of problems. Firstly, the example of the children's food model, where you put the vegetables at the front and the fatty foods at the back. Of the school kids, I imagine, as you say, the vast majority will pick will pick whatever's at the front, but there'll be a few who will beat the model and will think, well, actually, I really want some greasy fries for lunch. I'm going to go for that. And I think there's something troubling about taking advantage of the mass who don't think about it and leaving a small percentage to beat your system. In the second example, again, using this default premise, is the one about organ donation. It's not that I'm anti-organ donation. It's that there's something troubling about people not even thinking about the issue and then having their organs donated against any reasoning of their own. And my question is, given that governments have a choice to either intervene, nudging or doing something more active, or changing the way people think about a problem and encouraging people to actually engage with the issue and at least trying to act as rational agents as opposed to exploiting the instances in which they don't behave as rational agents, why would you nudge? And just to contemplate the idea of people bumbling through life, being nudged by one thing and another. I mean, there was a woman who, the lady a couple of questions in front of me was talking about the influence of advertising companies. And, I mean, even if it's for a public benefit, if you nudge someone on the subway, you're expected to apologize.
Great. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Maybe we needed a better title for the book. Libertarian, if you libertarian paternalist someone on the subway, there's no convention whether, okay. You might think, this is a great point, so you might think there are domains where you don't want to have a default rule one way or the other. You want to educate people and let them make their own decision. Okay, so how would that be turned into a reality? You might think for organ donations, instead of having the default rule be you're not going to be giving unless you say, or the opposite, people are going to be provided with information and required to make an active choice. Or you could say for savings plan, it's not going to be automatic non-enrollment or automatic enrollment. You're going to have to make an active choice. So there is a literature actually coming out of the economics department here on required active choosing, which frequently has an element of education preceding it. And I guess that's what you prefer. Okay, I see circumstances where that's better. Where would it be better? Where it would be better if we thought that the choice architect was self-interested or biased or incompetent, and then we really want the people to be making their own judgment. That would be there. And we might think with you that that the nudger should be apologetic. So there's a kind of moral reason always to have required active choosing preceded by education. Okay, fine. Here's a way into thinking that is in some domains but not all domains. Would you like it in a restaurant if the waiter said, what ingredients particularly do you want in this dish, rather than giving you 10 options? Would you like to have an infinite number of options Or do you like having 10? You can imagine if you're going to a foreign country where if you're required actively to choose things, you're going to be just overwhelmed. So a thought is the extreme version of what you're suggesting isn't life, and there's a reason it isn't life, that required active choosing would multiply the burdens of decision in too many domains and also lead us, given how busy we are, often either just randomly to pick or to blunder or to start yelling at our choice architecture, you tell me. So think a little bit, maybe this is a good example for domains in which what you're favoring isn't ideal. Believe it or not, there's one country in the world that took a very ambitious path towards Social Security privatization in recent memory, and that's Sweden. Sweden privatized Social Security and gave people not 10, not 30, not 100, not 200, but 450 options. Sweden did not, so every citizen of Sweden had a little book with 450 options, not such a little book. They didn't say, here's the default plan, this is what you're going to be in unless you go out. They instead did what you want. They had a lot of education for people, and they were so insistent on required active choosing, as we're calling it, that they had Harrison Ford come to Sweden and be in advertisements emphasizing, you make your own choice. And do you remember Indiana Jones, what university he taught at? The world of free markets, the University of Chicago. So Harrison Ford was doing required active choosing. Now, the Swedes did create a default plan. The experts created one. And all over the world, people thought the default plan is a good one. But they encouraged people to make their own choice rather than to default into the expert plan. They lost 40% of their money in the 3-year period after, on average, the Swedes did, because they went into internet stocks. And it was a little bit predictable they'd go into internet stocks. It was like investing in real estate about 4 years ago. Internet stocks were booming. Availability suggested that was the way to go. No, that was not the default. The default way outperformed individual choice and in mandatory individual choice. So the only suggestion is that there are domains in which education and required choosing is just a really big bother, and people hate it. Think, for example, I got some sort of plan. It was too complicated even to figure out what it was today. You're listening to the person who's subscribing to 5 magazines he hates, so I have a bias against required active choosing. And the plan was 6 pages, which seemed too much, and I put it down after a minute and thought, I wish they'd just default me into something sensible given my situation. And then I started preparing this talk. And so I take your point. It's a really good point, that there are areas where what you're suggesting is the preferred one. I guess the deepest question is whether the moral concern that this is manipulative is universally strong, or whether there are cases where the default by a planner is kind of a respectful way of saying to people, you're really busy, this is probably what's going to be best for you. If you don't like it, try something else. And I thank you.